Maier, Frederick T., August 11th, 1953. Petty Officer First Class, service number D10 6325.
Okay, why don't you tell me a little bit about your childhood experiences?
Well, I was probably one of the last of the baby boomers to be born. I was born in 1953, and I was born to a family of an older brother and an older sister, my mom and dad. And I had a younger brother later on that joined us when I was 9 years old. So I guess he's really the very end of the baby boomers. It was a typical family life back in the growing up in the 50s and the early 60s. Rock and roll was first starting. Elvis Presley was big. I remember when the Beatles came over from England, and Beatlemania and all the exciting stuff that's old to you guys right now. It was growing up in the Cold War when we had, instead of fire drills at school, we had bomb shelter drills, and we had to go out in the hallways and cover up and stay away from windows in case there was a nuclear attack. So the later 50s and early 60s were part of that era, where there were fallout shelters and air raid drills. We still saw a lot of World War II airplanes and jets. It was unusual to see a jet back then go across the sky. And if you saw one, everybody would rush out and look at the jet, because propeller aircraft were pretty much more common. The town I grew up in was a small town. There were more people on the Enterprise, the aircraft carrier that I went to, than there were in my hometown. There were 3,500 people in my hometown. When I graduated in 1971, it was the largest graduating class. We had 125 people in our graduating class in high school. Growing up, I worked with my dad. He was an electrician, and pretty much from the time I was about 10 years old or so, I worked with him during the summertime. And it was a unique experience, and I learned a lot from it. I learned to be very proud of my father by watching the other workers. I worked with, it was a mixture, an ethnic mixture. I grew up in New York State, not too far from New York City. So there were a lot of Italians, there were a lot of Irish, there were a lot of Germans, and there were a lot of Swedes. So it was an ethnic mixture. The working with them really gave me a good appreciation for my dad and for the hard-working work that men do as in the craft trades. I guess my high school experiences were pretty typical. It was I was on the baseball team. I ran cross country. I liked to hunt and fish, and I pretty much did whatever I wanted. We had lots of hot rods back then. Mustangs were out. First Mustang came out in 1965. I graduated in 71. So, you know, there was the era of the muscle cars back then. And if you could drove around with the hood off your car and put big fat slicks on the rear end and jacked up your car, you were pretty boss, as they called it back then. So that was after boss, it became cool. You know, I guess now it's rad. Now I guess you just hit knuckles, and that signifies the same thing. So the time goes on, but the pretty much everything stays the same. Long hair was the pretty much happening back then. It was the beginning of acid rock in the 70s, so and heavy metal. So Led Zeppelin was out back then, and the Doors. So your classification in school was you had your short hairs were your jocks pretty much, and your long hairs were your just your long-haired kids. So there weren't too many distinctions back then in classes. Growing up in upstate New York was pretty cool. Like I said, it was a small-town atmosphere. And we had the soda shop, and we had the diner where we all went down to and got cheeseburgers. And we didn't have a movie theater. We had to go to the next town over to go to the movies. During that age, it was okay to hitchhike. My mom and dad had no problems with me hitchhiking 15 or 20 miles, you know, to get to the next town over if we wanted to go to the movies. It was a different time than it is now.
Okay, why don't you tell me a little bit about your decisions to join and the time around when you were joining or drafted?
Well, coming from not a military family, but my dad was in the Navy during World War II, and he was on a subchaser in the Atlantic. And I kind of always knew that I would join the Navy. We didn't come from a family that was well-to-do, And your middle class families back then, it was pretty much expected during that era that you would join the military and serve for 4 years or 6 years or whatever, and then get out and go to work. So college was never really an option for a middle class family back then. It was more for the more well-to-do. So I graduated from school in middle of June, I guess it was, and about 3 or 4 days later, I hitchhiked from my small town of Somers to Peekskill, where the recruiting station was. It was about a 15, 16 mile drive or walk. And I walked into the Navy recruiter's office, sat down, said, "Here I am, put me in the Navy."
Okay. What kinds of things affected your decision to join, and why did you choose the Navy, over the other services?
Well, we were right in the middle of Vietnam, and I didn't want to become cannon fodder. So I and plus, like I said, I always knew that it was going to be the Navy. Just, it was a matter-of-fact decision. I just knew I was going to join the Navy like my father did. I didn't know I was going to stay in the Navy for 21 years. But after I was in there for a while, I figured I liked it and I enjoyed the travel, so I stayed in. I was 17 when I enlisted. I needed my mom and dad's permission to do it. And I enlisted in June. I went down to New York City, to Whitehall Street, if you've ever heard Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie. It's a big protest song back then. He talks about going down to Whitehall Street for a physical. And I was declared physically fit. And I raised my right hand and took the oath and joined the Navy. It was a delayed enlistment program. They asked me when I wanted to go on active duty. I told them right after hunting season would be fine. So on December 6th, 1971, I went off to boot camp.
Okay. What do you recall about your first couple days in the service, and can you tell me about some of your boot camp experiences?
First couple of days in boot camp, well, first couple of days I was wondering why I did what I did, to tell you the truth. And I said that I went off to boot camp on December 6th, and that was just before Christmas, and by the time Christmas rolled around, it was probably the loneliest I've ever been in my life, or had been up to that point. Very, very lonely, away from home for the first time. But everybody that I was in boot camp with was going through the exact same thing, so it didn't, you weren't alone. We were in World War II barracks, and for part of our boot camp experience, and there were cracks in the windows, and I went to boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois. And Great Lakes, Illinois, in December, well, you guys live in Michigan, you know pretty much what the winters can be like here. So we did a lot of shoveling snow, and shoveling snow.
Were there any funny or sad experiences that really stick in your mind from boot camp other than shoveling snow?
Well, yeah. We had to wash all of our clothing by hand. You're given a full sea bag when you join, which is all the clothing you need. They give you 4 pair of dungarees, 4 dungaree shirts, underwear, socks, etc. But during boot camp, you only get 2 pair of underwear, 2 socks, 2 t-shirts, and 2 pair of jeans and 2 work shirts, and that's what you wear during the entire boot camp. You wear one and you wash the other. And you wash them by hand in boot camp, and the Navy can't have you use clothespins, so they give you little pieces of string that you're supposed to tie your clothes up on the line with. And our company commander would come out and he would measure it and make sure that there were perfect square knots, and that there was only 1 inch sticking out on each side. And if it wasn't just perfect, he would tear it all down and stomp it in the ground. Then you'd have to wash your clothing all over again. Well, these little pieces of string would get sopping wet. And like I said, it's Great Lakes. You called it Great Mistakes. But Great Mistakes in the wintertime, you walk out with this piece of wet string, and as soon as you get outside, it freezes, and you're trying to tie a perfect knot with a frozen piece of string. So imagine trying to tie a knot on an icicle, and that's about what it was like. Boot camp was kind of fun. I enjoyed it. It was lots of push-ups, lots of physical exercise, but the purpose of boot camp was to make everybody seem exactly the same, Didn't matter what kind of family you came from, whether you were rich or poor. If your hair was long when you joined the Navy, it was short the day after you joined the Navy. Everybody was exactly the same, and that's what made boot camp not easy, but it wasn't hard to deal with because everybody was in the same boat. When things got really hard, like one night somebody set the barracks on fire smoking when they weren't supposed to, and we did push-ups all night long. Company commander wanted to know, all right, who set the barracks on fire? Well, we stick together and nobody admitted it. So we did push-ups all night long. And I got through situations like that by placing myself back home, and I just put my mind back in the woods or on the lake, and I'd make believe I was fishing or hunting, and just let my mind take care of it.
Okay. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your experiences right when you got into the Navy, like what wars you were in, and kind of some of the places that you went.
So before I joined the Navy, I never traveled much. We came from lower middle class families, so we didn't get to travel. So going to Illinois from New York was my first experience, and it was my first time on an airplane. And after I finished boot camp, I went to an engineman A school, and I learned all about diesels and air conditioning and refrigeration. While I was there in Great Lakes going to school, I got orders to Anchorage, Alaska. And I was really excited because I always wanted to go to Alaska, liking to hunt and fish. Well, the day before I was supposed to leave for Alaska, my orders got changed, and this being the year of Vietnam, and they sent me to the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and it was home ported out of Alameda, California. So I went home for 2 weeks leave, saw all my friends from school. They wished me good luck, and my family saw me off, and I went off to Alameda, California, and a couple months after that, we left for Vietnam.
How long were you in, like, and around the Vietnam general area? Like, for how long during the war were you there?
Well, that was 1972, and I did 2 cruises in Vietnam, 2 9-month cruises on the Enterprise. When an aircraft carrier leaves the United States and goes on a cruise, was called the WestPac, Western Pacific. Everything in the Navy has an anagram. WestPac for Western Pacific, Med Cruise is a Mediterranean cruise, etc. So our WestPac cruises usually they were supposed to last 6 months, but they were never anything shorter than 9, sometimes up to a year in length. When we left the States, we would go to Subic Bay in the Philippines, Republic of the Philippines, and that would be our home port overseas. And then we would go out for what they called line periods, and we were all distinctive members of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club. I take great pride in being a member of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club. So we would go out for a period on the line. We would bomb the enemy and do the things that Navy ships do. And then we would go back in for a little R&R to Subic Bay or Hong Kong, Singapore. There was one time where we had to go, there was an uprising in the Arabian Gulf, and they called us off station from Vietnam, and they sent us into the Indian Ocean. And we punched holes in the Indian Ocean for quite a while, just showing the flag. A lot of times they'll send an aircraft carrier to a spot in the world where there's trouble brewing, just in case they need the firepower, so it's readily available. While we were in the Indian Ocean, I got the distinct privilege of crossing the equator, and I left the ranks of the polywogs and became a trusty shellback. It's a time-honored tradition in the Navy when you cross the equator, where King Neptune and Davy Jones come on board your ship and initiate you in the ancient honored traditions of the seafaring men. When we did that, the USS Enterprise was steaming along, and a mile from the equator, we stopped, the American flag came down, and the Jolly Roger gets hoisted up. And during that time frame, it was the height of the Cold War, there was always a Russian trawler, quote-unquote fishing boat, but full of antennas and spyware, that was always following us. And I often wondered what their what they wondered when they saw the American flag come down and the Jolly Roger hoisted up to the top of the Enterprise's mast. So, but they knew what was going on because they were sailors just like us, and it doesn't matter what navy you're in. If you're a sailor, you're a sailor, and when you cross the equator, you become a member of that club. And it's a privilege to be a member of that club.
Okay, so what exactly was your duty or job on the Enterprise?
I worked on the catapults on the Enterprise below the decks, and we did all the maintenance and supplied the steam power to launch the ship, launch the jets, the jet aircraft off the ship. So I worked on the catapult crew. So on an aircraft carrier, you have your ship's company and you have your airedales. And your airedales are attached to the air wing, and they do all the maintenance and work on the aircraft. And then the ship's company takes care and does all the work of the ship itself.
Okay. And move on. Why don't you tell me a little bit about like life at sea and away from home during the war? Like how you stayed in touch with your family and kind of what that was like.
Well, this was, if you can imagine, a period before cell phones and before email and before text messaging. We had to do things the real old-fashioned way, and that was with mail. And when you were in the war zone, you didn't even have to use a stamp. You just wrote "free" up where the stamp goes on your envelope, and that took care of the postage. So you didn't even have to buy I think it was a 14-cent stamp back then to mail a letter. Life at sea was very, very busy. Ship operates 24 hours a day. You don't get very much time off, and in a wartime situation, you're there to do a job, and the job is not very nice to do, but it's the job that you have to do to defend your country. So we were at general quarters hours and hours and hours, days on end sometimes. During the last big offensive, we were bombing Hanoi 24 hours a day, for about 15 days straight. And we slept on station. When the jets came in, they refueled. If they were shot up, we literally went out and put duct tape over the machine gun holes, if they were serviceable, to cover the holes. Hit the dents in with a ball-peen hammer, put tape on it, loaded them up with fuel, machine gun bullets, 500-pound bombs, and they went off again. And this was a never-ending cycle for about 15 days straight we did that. During that time frame, I remember my pillow was a fire extinguisher. And I slept on station. We ate sea rats, which were well before the fashionable MREs that you hear about today. These are the same sea rats that they used back in the 40s during World War II. And you had a little handy-dandy called the John Wayne can opener. And you kept your John Wayne on your keychain. And you would open up your can of mystery meat, we like to call it, because you literally ate it and you had no idea what it was, because it tasted like something, but you couldn't really figure out what it was. The pork and beans, were hot dogs and beans, and that was the best because that tasted at least like hot dogs and beans. You had little crackers called hardtack, with a little thing of peanut butter and a little thing of jelly. You got a little miniature pack of cigarettes. I think there were 4 cigarettes in the pack, and a Hershey bar, and a thing of chiclets and a thing of toilet paper. That's what came in your sea rats. So, being on a ship, we really didn't need the toilet paper, so that's what it was like at sea during combat.
So you said the food was pretty bad. When you got fresh supplies and got fresh food, did they serve it right away? Did they save it? What was it like when you would refuel on supplies?
An aircraft carrier is really, really large, and you can carry a lot of food. And when the supply ship would bring fresh supplies out, the Navy is made predominantly up of 17 to 22-year-old men. They make up the backbone of the Navy. And it's just like all of you high school kids out there right now. The one thing you miss most is good sweet cereal, milk, and ice cream. And when a supply ship would come up, those would be the first things that everybody would dive into. The food on board ship was actually pretty good. it wasn't. We don't always didn't eat sea rats, only when we were at general quarters for a long period of time. But the food, they serve 5,000 people 4 meals a day. So the chow line is open pretty much probably about 21 hours a day. You can go and you can eat on board the ship. But when the fresh milk would come on board, it came in the big 6-gallon containers with a little white tube coming out. And we would literally just cut the tube and pass it around drinking the white milk or the chocolate milk. And sometimes when the ice cream came on, it came in the big 5 or 6-gallon containers, and everybody carried a spoon in their pockets, and we would all just open it up and dig into the ice cream right away. If I could tell you one story about when we were in the Indian Ocean, we were in the Indian Ocean we left the Vietnam right after Thanksgiving without pulling back into the Philippines. And we went directly to the Indian Ocean where they needed us on station. Well, if you can imagine 5,000 people on board a ship the month before Christmas on radio silence and not getting any mail whatsoever, we were a pretty lonely group of 5,000 men. The Russian trawler that was with us they were in a lot worse situation than us, because we were an aircraft carrier. We could make our own water, and they were just a small ship. Well, about the week before Christmas, you couldn't even look at your friend without getting into a fight. That's how tense people were. Everybody was very, very homesick. Christmas was coming right around the corner. There was no prospect of a mail call, of getting any fresh supplies or anything. 2 days before Christmas, you couldn't even look at your buddy, or he might hit you. That's how tense we were. On Christmas Eve, just before sunset, a ship came up over the horizon. And I'll never forget this. It was the USS White Plains, which is the same city I was born in, back in New York. And in the Navy, they still use semaphore, and the signal light flashed, "Ho, ho, ho, Merry Christmas, Enterprise." And the White Plains had all of our mail, all of the Christmas packages, and all the fresh food for 5,000 men. The Navy supplies their ships at sea by what they call an UNREP, an underway replenishment, where both ships sail side by side, and they stretch lines across, and they transfer the cargo, fuel, food, mail across those lines. And at the same time, they do it by a VERT-REP, which means vertical replenishment, with helicopters. So we were on the flight deck of the Enterprise, and we literally just tore into the boxes of oranges and apples and fresh fruit, because it had been almost 2 months since we had any fresh produce. And we were up there, and I looked over, and the Russian trawler was maybe 100 yards off of our side. And a bunch of us started taking apples and oranges and bananas and throwing them off the side of the ship as close as we could get. And the Russian trawler came in and started scooping up the fresh fruit and that we were throwing over with nets, big fishing nets. And pretty soon they were close enough to us where we could actually throw an apple or an orange and reach them. And the captain of the ship came over and saw what we were doing, and instead of yelling at us, he had a helicopter pick up a pallet full of steaks, lobster, ice cream, milk, and fresh fruit, and deliver it to the Russian sailors. Like I said, when you're a sailor at sea, you're a sailor. It doesn't matter what nation you are.
Okay. So you said the stress could get pretty high around Christmas time and around like when it had been a while between mail calls. What was the general stress level? And what was the difference between when you were at general quarters and working on combat and when you just your downtime or your average day?
Average day would be sometimes you would work 12 hours on, 12 hours off, and sometimes you would work 8 hours on and have 16 hours off. It depended on the workload. But during your time off, you usually stood another 4-hour watch maintaining the equipment during that time frame. You worked 7 days a week. Sundays were generally, a day of worship, and you didn't do anything other than stand your watches. They didn't, unless it was wartime. So Sundays were pretty much a day off under normal circumstances. You'd get up, Since the ship operates 24 hours a day, sometimes if you're working like the GM plant, you're working the mid shift or the evening shift. So if you on a regular day, you get up and eat breakfast, go to work, um, eat lunch, work the rest of the afternoon, and then in the afternoon, during the evening after dinner, they'd show a couple of movies on board the ship. I remember we had the movie African Queen and the movie Psycho. And those were the only two movies that we had on board the ship for, about 3 weeks. Well, everybody knew every line of Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen. And after a while, we would just turn the volume off in the television and just say the words. Everybody knew them by heart. Every ship has its own post office, and it has its own postal frank, so because each ship is its own little city. And the larger ships, like the aircraft carriers, have an actual television studio that they broadcast, so they can broadcast to the other ships that are escorting it. Because we usually had a destroyer underway with us all the time. That way, if a plane went down, they could scoop up the pilot.
Okay. Did you have like something that you did for luck before you would go into like a combat situation? Like, was there kind of a lucky charm that you had?
I wore my St. Christopher medal, and I wore that same St. Christopher medal. I still wear the same medal, and I wore it all the way through 21 years in the Navy.
Okay.
It's pretty much some people have luck, it's your own faith.
Okay. What did you do, like, for fun on the ship, and then what did you do for leave when you were off the ship?
Well, once we left the being on station and out in the Tonkin Gulf, we would hit Liberty ports. Like I mentioned earlier, we hit Hong Kong, Singapore, Philippines. We pulled into Mombasa, Kenya. That was really neat. It was like going back in time, back to the Humphrey Bogart movie that we've been watching, kind of. So when you would hit the port, some sailors would go to the bars. Some people would go to the cultural centers. I like beer, and I made it a point to try the local food wherever I was because I like to eat. And I had many, many different types of beer. Some were delicious and some were terrible. Tusker beer from Kenya. I'll never forget it. It had a picture of an elephant with a huge tusk sticking out of it. And it kind of tasted like they've stuck the bottle, waited for the elephant to go to the bathroom, and then bottled it. That's how terrible it was. Yep, by the same token, we got to drink some pretty good stuff and eat some really good food. I always made it a point, if I liked the food, since I like to cook as well, and I always have, I would ask them how to teach me to make the food. And when you show an appreciation in a different country for their customs and their food, people usually take it the right way and enjoy teaching you and showing you. Recreation on board the ship was, we had a little store that you could go buy what we call pogey bait, which is candy and stuff like that. You could, they showed movies on board the ship on the ship's television. There were gyms where you could work out. We had a couple acre, place up on the flight deck where you could run. So a lot of people would run. One of the members of my shop was a very, very good amateur golfer, and he played in the amateur all-Navy tournament and won several times in a row. And he used to bring a bucket of balls to sea with him, and we had a little mat, one of those little grass mats that we would set up, and he would hit golf balls off into the ocean. I remember one time there was a model airplane club, and they were flying their model airplanes off the deck of the Enterprise, and the radio controls that they were using for it was affecting the controls of some of the newer aircraft that they were experimenting on, so they had to stop that right away.
That's pretty cool. I'm gonna move on to like what you did after your service. Can you tell me a little bit about what, like, the last day of your service? Do you remember the feeling?
I remember exactly what I did the last day of my Navy career. The first day of my Navy career, my father, who I respect very, very much, saw me off at the airport, shook my hand, and said, "Keep your nose clean." And 21 years and 2 months later, my father was waiting at the gate in Maryland, where I retired, and he was waiting right there for me. So he started my career with me, and I walked out and shook my hand. So that was kind of special to me.
What did you do after you got out? Did you go back to school, join the workforce?
After I got out of the Navy, I had one of the best jobs that I ever had. My son was born in Iceland, and he was our Viking baby. And when I retired from the Navy, my wife went back to work, and I became Mr. Mom. And from the time he was 2 when I retired, and from the time he was 2 until the third grade, I was a stay-at-home dad, and I had the privilege of being the only dad in the classes, bringing in cookies and reading to the kids and stuff like that. And I got to know a lot of the kids in the graduating class of 2009. So it's just by being with them in school. So that was probably the best job that I ever had, bar none, being a Mr. Dad at home.
Okay. Did you ever make any attempts to go back to school after you got out?
Yep, after I got done being Mr. Dad, I figured it was time to go to work or do something when I started inviting the UPS man in for coffee because I was so bored. So I started driving school bus here in Lowell, where I got to know a lot more of the kids. And then I was Mr. Fred to a lot of them. I coached YMCA soccer, so I was a soccer coach as well. And after a while, I loved kids and I liked to teach, so I used my GI Bill to go back to school to get my teaching degree. I made it about 3/4 of the way through it, and I realized by the time that I finished my degree and got my teaching certificate that I would only have a couple of years to really pursue that career. So I stopped pursuing that angle and continued driving. Now I drive special ed, which has its own rewards.
Did you make any close friends in the service that you still talk to?
Made a lot of close friends, and during a wartime situation, you make a lot of close friends, but you always keep a barrier up kind of between you, because tomorrow that best friend might not be there. And if you do that too many times, it's really hard to do your work. So you tend to not make a lot of really close friends. Out of 21 years in the Navy, there are 3 guys that I can pick up the phone, call them up right now, and they would welcome me into their home, no matter where they were or what they were doing. We were that close. So I stay in contact with 2 of them right now. Both their wives have died, and I've flown across the country both times to be at their wives' funerals. And their kids are like my own, and really close. So you maintain a couple of close friendships, but I'd rather have a couple of really close friendships than a lot of them that don't mean as much.
After you got out, did you ever join any veterans organizations, go to any reunions with like the people you served with?
No, I never liked the veterans, any of those veterans clubs and stuff where you got a whole bunch of old guys that are big and fat sitting around telling all their war stories, and I could never picture myself doing that, to tell you the truth. So the only reunions I've had where the phone rings and it's my buddy Dave Tevis, who lives out in Minnesota, or my other buddy Dave Favor, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to be rolling through." And then we sit down and we laugh about the old times and have dinner and just enjoy being close friends. So I don't need an organization or a club to remind me and tell me what I did for my country.
Okay. How did your time in the military affect your thinking about the war, the government, the military, that type of thing?
Well, it made me realize that one of the biggest oxymorons there is military intelligence. Because there's a term in the Navy. It's called snafu. I mean, situation normal, all fouled up, and it seems to be pretty much what it goes by. It's but when you look at the overall picture, it's a huge organization, and there's always going to be some problems. You can't run a football team on the football field without having some foul ups. So it's awful hard to imagine running an organization of hundreds of thousands of people without any foul ups as well. And when you're doing it where lives are at stake, both yours and everybody else's, it's a pretty well run organization all in all. Gave me a lot of respect for the military. I don't have any regrets whatsoever about joining. I look at it now, and sometimes I think that it would be a good experience for my son or any other one to go through. But at the same token, I can sit back and think, well, I did 21 years. Maybe that's enough, so maybe he doesn't need to do it. Personally, I hope that no one ever has to go to war again, because war is terrible. And anybody that enjoys it, there's something wrong with it. They're really sick. It's a terrible experience. It's not fun. It's a necessary evil. But to protect this country and give everybody the freedom to vote, to protest, and to walk around and do what they want to do, it's well worth it. Every time I re-enlisted, I swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Okay. How did your service experiences affect, your life outside the service afterwards?
Gave me a much greater appreciation of our country. Walking around other countries, I remember in Hong Kong, where it's not uncommon for dead bodies to be laying on the sidewalk. And when you're walking down through certain sections of town, you're literally stepping over dead bodies. And after a couple of days, they scoop them up and take them I don't know where. You don't have that. You don't see that here in the United States. You take a lot for granted here in the United States. If we lose electricity because the power's out and we lose it for 2 days, it's a lot. We're very, very spoiled, and we take an awful lot for granted. And when you travel throughout the world, and you see how other people live and their day-to-day lives, it really makes you appreciate being an American and appreciate what you have a lot more when you come back home. And it's very hard sometimes to see some of these people that are complaining about what they have, and you want to reach up and smack them across the head with a 2x4 to gain their attention and let them know how bad their life could be and how bad it is in other countries. And maybe they shouldn't complain, as much about their situation. Does that answer that question?
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like to add that we didn't really get to, or we didn't get to cover, anything you'd like to say?
Yes, there is something. I spent 21 years, like I mentioned, defending this country. And I take great pride in that. Many of my friends died when I was in the service. Like I said, war is not a fun place to be. And when those friends of mine died, they were placed in a casket, and the American flag was placed over that casket. And I would like to address the Lowell area schools about the deplorable way that they handle our national ensign. Sometimes it's flying from the high school mast, torn, ripped, shredded. Sometimes it's dangling by one line. The line at the flag at the baseball field flies all night long, all during baseball season, without any lights on it. I think that Lowell area schools should show the respect to the flag that the American flag deserves.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The following oral military history project is a series of documentaries in association with the Lowell area men and women who proudly served and sacrificed part of their lives to preserve the opportunities for all of us to build our businesses and raise our families under a blanket of freedom. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.